Hi friends, David Beshefkin here with a quick, very exciting message from our sponsors. Our 1840 community has been nurturing a broad but deeply rooted and inspired Judaism. We're not just hanging on, surviving, going through the motions, but we are looking to thrive. And I have a very exciting opportunity that I am proud to highlight on 1840. And it is an opportunity to really not just discuss the theories that we've spoken about, but really build a life in a very practical and tangible way. This is not a drill. I'm here to talk about a new community called Eden, which is forming in Beit Shemesh proper. The project is being built overlooking the Ela Valley near existing parks, schools, and shopping centers. Very, very green. It's gorgeous. I know so many people who are thinking about where to build their lives, specifically post October 7th, thinking that they want a connection, whether it's making Aliyah or some connection to the land of Israel in a more significant way. And this is an incredible opportunity. Eden will have its own shul, base medrash, and a 5-minute walk from both Scheinfeld and Nofei HaShemesh neighborhoods. For more information about getting in early on this project with a payment plan that you can afford, contact Rena Weinberg at info@edenbeitshemesh.com. Again, that's Rena Weinberg at info@edenbeitshemesh.com. Eden is spelled E-D-E-N, Beit Shemesh, B-E-I-T. Shemesh is S-H-E-M-E-S-H.com. This is your chance to learn more about Eden, the community you've been searching for and dreaming about. Email Rena Weinberg now. Link is in the description. I really look at this as a privilege to highlight on 1840. There are so many developments. I know the people involved in this one. I am very seriously considering investing. I don't right now think I'm going to be able to make Aliyah, but I want a place for myself in Israel, and this is it. An incredible opportunity. Don't ignore it. Reach out to Rena Weinberg at info@edenbeitshemesh.com to finally make our dreams into your reality. Hi friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration of Israel diaspora relations, and we've already stated how much I hate the word diaspora. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org. That's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. There is a fascinating article that my friend Jeffrey Sachs, the editor-in-chief of Tradition magazine, wrote in the fall of 2006 in the pages of Tradition, called Rabbi Soloveitchik Meets Rav Kook. And it's a really fascinating article. It's really a translation of, an earlier work by Rav Moshe Taragin called Sichot Haraya, Rav Kook Talks, where he shares kind of vignettes about Rav Kook's life, and he translated the sections that talk about Rav Soloveitchik. Of course, we're talking about Rav Joseph Dov Soloveitchik, Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who served as one of the major leaders, if not the major leader, of the centrist modern Orthodox community. He was a part of the yeshiva world that split apart more and more in the 60s and 70s. We're not going to talk about that now, but Rav Soloveitchik was like this towering figure associated with what was then called American Judaism, American Orthodox Judaism. And once he met Rav Kook. That, of course, we are referring to Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael. It was known as Palestine at the time. He died before the establishment of the state of Israel, but so much of his philosophy and his worldview still impacts the experience of what it is like being within the religious Zionist community, particularly in Israel. In America, as so much of this episode discusses, we are still feeling the reverberations of Rabbi Soloveitchik. And when they met in 1935, it's just so fascinating. And he tells it over so well. It's a beautiful translation with some biographical background. But in this piece, Rav Moshe Taragin recalls when Rabbi Soloveitchik visited Eretz Yisrael. It was in the summer of 1935, July of 1935. And he gave a shiur. He still remembers. He gave a class in Tractate Nedarim at Merkaz Harav. Afterwards, he met one-on-one with Rav Kook. It's remarkable article, Rav Moshe Taragin actually mentions that he still had with him, he saved it for 42 years. There's a notebook that all the visitors, that people who came to visit Rav Kook would write in, like a visitor's book. I've seen these before. Sometimes like hotels have them. Sometimes museums even have them. I've seen it a handful of times at Shiva homes. When it would be a very crowded Shiva home, there's a book where you can write and, write a message of the visit, because it's hard to know otherwise. So apparently Rav Kook had this visitor's book, and Rabbi Soloveitchik left a message in there, which I found fascinating. I didn't remember this or know about this until reading Jeffrey Sachs's article, Rabbi Soloveitchik Meet Rav Kook. And this is what, again, Rav Moshe Taragin takes out of this visitor's book. This is what he said Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote. Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote, "I too add my prayers to those of the Jewish people, asking mercy for the well-being of Rabbeinu Hagadol, the Prince of Israel, and its glory." This is obviously in translation from the original Hebrew, Maran Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook Shlita. Israel lifts her eyes to heaven, that he who dwells on high should send a complete healing to the Gon of Yeshurun and its splendor, and return him to his original strength, well and whole, that he may come and go before Am Yisrael. And it was signed Tuesday, Parshas Pinchas 5695, which corresponds to July 16th, 1935, Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, Boston, USA. And what is so fascinating in this passage, Rabbi Soloveitchik actually says what drew him, what stood out to him most about Rav Kook's Torah. And he said Rav Kook's most philosophically developed work, this is Rabbi Soloveitchik reminiscing, what was it that captured him? He says Orot HaTshuva, which is Rav Kook's work where he discusses the mechanisms of repentance. And Rabbi Soloveitchik continues, and his most significant innovation is that teshuva is not connected to sin per se, but is comprised of man's returning to himself, returning to his source. And now that idea, I think, has trickled in much more within the American world about what teshuva is all about, returning to that source, that sense of self that is organic and real, as opposed to just, fear of sin and God, exacting revenge if you don't follow his laws, which is a very different emphasis, which, we hear less. But in the 1930s, that is what jumped out to Rabbi Soloveitchik, that difference in the way that they describe tshuva. And I think in many ways, it gets to the heart of many of the cultural differences between the Judaism that we experience in Israel, and we're focusing on the Dati Leumi community, the religious Zionist community, but a lot of these distinctions are equally true of the Haredi community versus the American Yeshivish community, which I hope to do a future episode on. I think it's such an important topic. What are the differences between those two communities? I think it's very much misunderstood. The Israeli Haredi community versus the American Yeshivish community. I think they are night and day, totally different. But we're focusing on the Israeli Dati Leumi community and the American modern Orthodox community. And I think in many ways, this distinction that Rabbi Soloveitchik highlights of the approach to teshuva, in many ways is a central difference between the American modern Orthodox community and the community of the Dati Leumi community in Israel. Whereas I think this idea of teshuva being returned to self, of religiosity being something very organic, expressing something very natural that fits and aligns with your natural day-to-day life, I think is something baked into the very heart and experience of what it is like being religious in Israel. It is not an appendage. It is not something that you are carrying with you on a knapsack, so to speak. It is your very identity integrated deeply into who you are, not because of necessarily the boundaries that halacha creates, though obviously halacha is a major part of religious life in Israel, but the way that it's integrated into your life is much less about separation. It is much less about like a preventative boundary, and it is much more, I have found, about self-expression, about finding a way that the halachic system is actually the way that you are able to express yourself creatively, interpret, and really integrate deeply into your life. So integrated sometimes that sometimes it could come at the expense of the seriousness of the system as a legal system. That's definitely something that's grappled with. And on the flip side, it's so natural, it's so ingrained, like you think about it differently. Everything comes at a cost. On the flip side, in America, I think the way that we experience halacha, because our neighbors are so different than us. We feel maybe not the sense of sin that Rabbi Soloveitchik was talking about in regards to teshuvah, but definitely as a boundary. There's a lot at stake. Halacha in many ways feels like it's like the boundary when you step out onto a skyscraper, on a precipice, when you walk to the Grand Canyon. There always is a boundary to make sure you don't fall in, to make sure you don't lose and assimilate and totally lose the identity and the legacy that we've carried through the millennia of exile. And in America, I think you experience halacha much more in that sense, as avoiding from sin, avoiding from the abyss of assimilation, and losing the traditions that we have fostered with us. We see halacha much more as like the railing, so to speak, that ensures that we don't fall off the staircase, that we don't fall off the side of the road or off the mountain, so to speak. Not to say, of course, we deeply influence one another, and these distinctions are not like, it's not a total binary with a line through the sand, but I do think these differences animate the religious experiences that people have in Israel and America, both of which, of course, have advantages, and both of those advantages, whether it's America or in Israel, of course, come at a cost. And to really dive into the nuances of these distinctions, I could think of no one better. She's someone who we have been WhatsApping for ages, and like on a very personal level, I am so grateful for their back and forth, not in this episode, but really over the years since 1840 has started Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg, who teaches both Israeli and American post-high school students, and she serves as the mashgicha ruchanit in the Stella K. Abraham Beit Medrash for women in Migdal Oz, an affiliate of Yeshivat Har Etzion. She also wrote a book that I absolutely love. It's a wonderful book called What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear in Decision-Making at Life's Crossroads and Everyday Living, which is really like a reflection on how to make healthy, resonant religious decisions. It's an absolutely wonderful book. She worked as a yoetzet halacha for several years in America and now in Israel. And I'm just so grateful, more than this episode, more than all of her accolades, she is somebody who exudes a thoughtful authenticity that I think is sometimes a rare quality to find in this modern world. She doesn't operate on strict partisan lines of whatever worldview, what we call like a hashkafa that we navigate. We often talk about how we try to relate to the hashkafically homeless, those who don't have a neat camp and a neat worldview. And it really is a privilege to introduce our audience to Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg, somebody who on the deepest personal level for me has been an inspiration and really encouraged me to explore with nuance, with sensitivity, with authenticity, our contemporary religious life. I have learned so much from her, and I have no doubt that this is just the beginning. I hope if this is the first time you are hearing from her, and if this is not the first time, you are all the more lucky. And without further ado, here is our conversation with Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg. So this is really an absolute pleasure, and to have someone who we have been in touch for quite a few years now, talking about some of the topics that we've discussed on 1840, and it is a privilege to invite Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg onto 1840. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
So we're spending some time now thinking about the relationship and the connection between Israel and diaspora, specifically America, because I think it changes depending on the country. I've spent time in other countries and there are definitely different relationships. And one of the topics that has always fascinated me is how religiously the communities differ. We oftentimes like to make loose comparisons. We think about the yeshiva community in America and loosely compare them to the Haredi community in Israel. We look at the modern Orthodox community in America and we loosely compare that to the Dati Leumi community in Israel. I could go on, but they're not actually alike. And I was wondering to hear from you specifically with your population that you work with. You work with modern Orthodox women, but we could talk beyond that. But really, given your population that you work with, how would you articulate the religious differences between Israel and America?
Okay, it's such an important question, and definitely something that I find people are thinking more and more about as Israel is in the news and it's on everybody's minds. So I want to first of all start off by saying that I could only share my own personal observations, which is obviously always true about everybody. and our observations are limited, to our specific experiences and exposures. So just to give some background, like I spent over 30 years in America in mostly what people would refer to as centrist or modern Orthodox communities in the New York, New Jersey area, plus 3 short years in Philadelphia. And the last 13 years I've been in Israel in the Dati Leumi community in Alonshvad and Gush Etzion, which is going to mean that my outlook is obviously going to be different than someone who's from, what we would refer to as out-of-town communities in America, or someone living in other places in Israel, such as the Golan or Beersheba. That being said, in my work teaching in the Women's Beit Midrash in Migdal Uz, I am exposed to and work closely with Israeli students from all over Israel, and also with overseas students from a wide spectrum of communities in America and from even places, like you said, in Europe, South Africa, and Australia. So I do think that gives me a broader perspective, and still my community or my experience is only, I guess, one segment, of that broader Dati community. And I want to be careful that it's clear that while I think some of the things I say will resonate broadly with anyone who's Dati Leumi, I think other observations, will not necessarily apply to everyone. And I want to just give the context of where I'm speaking from right now.
And I just want to translate it for some of our listeners because they may not even know what the term means. Dati Leumi. Just explain what those words mean. They're Hebrew words, and we use the word Dati. It's a Hebrew word. We usually use it interchangeably with meaning like religious. Leumi means like national. So like the national religious Zionist movement.
That's what people will refer to it as. And I think, there's a lot to say, and I've spoken about in other forums, the difference between the word Dati, which is religious, and the word Orthodox, or obviously the difference between modern and the word Leumi, which is national. And I like to try to think, especially as someone who made Aliyah and now finds herself in a different context, I try to think about what are the big underlying central ideas that could help us organize and give context to some of the topics that we're going to speak about. So when I try to personally do that for myself and think about, okay, what did I experience in my community in America? What am I experiencing now in Israel? It's been helpful for me personally to frame the issues in a way that really organizes what I saw and what I see around me. And in that framing, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that a lot of the differences in the religious experience of the two communities that I've been a part of goes back to 2 really key foundational figures. And that's the figure of Rabbi Joseph B Soloveitchik in the American centrist Orthodox community and of Rav Kook in the Israeli Dati Leumi community. Both figures were so significant in their communities that they're just referred to as the Rav, or in Israel, Harav, the rabbi, and everybody knows. Rabbi. Yeah, and everybody knows automatically who you're talking about. So while it's also important for me to be clear here that these were such big personalities and such towering figures with so many dimensions that, of course, even as I talk about Rav Soloveitchik through the prism of my father, who was a Talmud of him, and through the communities that I was a part of, I'm sure there's other people who experienced other parts of Rav Soloveitchik, as we know, and who have different mesuras from him, and so too with Rav Kook. So it is important to state that, and it's also important to say that one other difference, which I think people don't always pay attention to, is that Rav Soloveitchik in the modern Orthodox, centrist Orthodox community in America was really considered like a founding figure who really helped create that stream of centrist Orthodoxy in America and was associated very closely with Yeshiva University, which is still one of the flagship institutions of that stream of Judaism. Whereas people don't always realize that Rav Kook died before the state of Israel even existed. And
Correct.
He was certainly not Dati Leumi in the way that we think of as the community today when we call it community Dati Leumi, but the Dati Leumi community was deeply, deeply informed and inspired by a worldview of Rav Kook. So even though in both of these communities today, it's been years, obviously, since anyone has had any direct contact with either of these figures, there's 3 core differences that I want to touch on that really, I feel, have completely influenced the philosophies and the development of these 2 communities in very significant ways, and then could help us kind of understand from there.
Let's hear. What are those three differences?
Okay, so if I could jump into the first one has to do with their overall approach and their outlook on Torah and on the world. Okay, Rav Soloveitchik came from the world and the dynasty of brisker learning, which means he was very analytical, he was very intellectual. That was his approach to studying Torah specifically. We know the Talmud, Gemara. It's an approach that brings a critical lens to the material, that like kind of stands back and analyzes it, tries to categorize it, which is going to be very important, tries to categorize the content and tries to organize it into clear, understandable boxes. And it's very, very, very rational. So Rav Soloveitchik spoke and he wrote a lot about dichotomies, and he tried to intelligently understand and synthesize them. And his Gemara Shirim, which he was famous for, and his popular Tshuvot Drashot, and his writings on halacha and his machshava, all of it is like very clear, very rational, very organized, and you could feel like the brilliance of his sharp mind. Or in his philosophical works, he even integrates academic approaches and draws heavily on his secular, knowledge. Whereas Rav Kook's approach to Torah and to the world, from what I understand of it, and I know that you are much more of a scholar of Rav Kook than I am. I have not read a lot of Rav Kook, unfortunately, but from what I understand of it, it was much more esoteric, much more mystical, much more spiritual, much more focused on what's going on internally behind the surface. Meaning, like, a lot of his books are called Orot, Orot HaTshuva. What's the hidden light behind the tangible? Now, of course, Rav Soloveitchik also cared very much about the internal experience, but he often focused on how that internal experience, let's say joy on Yom Tov, or the sadness of pain of mourning, how they express themselves in external actions. Our halacha, our
like in
day-to-day
halacha,
practice.
yeah, in Jewish law.
Right. So Rav Kook was more focused on the pnim, and he was also very, very rooted in our connection as the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So I would say that as opposed to dichotomies and categories and things like that, he was always looking for a unity of purpose and a unity of direction. And he felt like the whole world is pointing towards that goal of geula, of redemption, in some united cosmology. The whole world is like singing a song or getting a tune to Torah. And he saw Kedusha, he saw holiness in everything. And he tries to help us through his writings feel that intangible holiness. And I would say his entire spiritual genre was just much more poetic. It wasn't analytical.
It was for sure, yes.
Yeah, it's not analytical. It's not philosophical in that same way as Rav Soloveitchik's is. And I think that's why sometimes people see his writings as having much more in common with works of Chassidut, than with Lumdis in terms of like their search for and their yearning and what's beyond. So I just want to say one more thing. I don't want anyone to think that Rav Kook wasn't a master of halacha. He wrote Tshuvot on halacha, and he was certainly a huge Talmud Chacham in those areas, but his legacy in the Israeli community seems to be his approach to seeing the depth of what lies behind the practices and ideas that make up our day-to-day life. At least that's my sense, that Israeli youth are like raised on the more spiritual and mystical works. And I think that these differences very much affect, and I could talk about practical, like concrete ways, the ways that the communities run.
It's interesting. I see the relationship that Americans, the modern Orthodox community, and the Dati Leumi community have with halacha is very, very different. Halacha in general in America feels much more like a system of law, where in Israel it feels much more, to me at least, like a way of life.
You're nailing it.
And you see this with younger students. Like, I want to see especially how Americans and Israelis interact, because one of the most interesting things to me, and I know you're in the middle of your list.
No, not at all. This leads exactly into the second thing I was going to say. Perfect.
But like, it's so interesting to me that we have this gap year program, which we'll get to and we will talk more about. But we send kids to Israel, and predominantly most of the seminaries and yeshivas are giving over a very Americanized version of Yiddishkeit that will allow them to be more successful in America, but actually, and I apologize for saying this, I hope it's not controversial, I think it makes them more distant from Israelis.
You are correct, and there's a lot to say about that I think we will get to. But your point about halacha as being like more of a system as opposed to like, a natural way of life, I think stems out of, I think it is important to understand how a lot of that does go back to what I was describing between Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook. And it's not just in terms of like the more like the categorizing or like the systems and the analysis versus the more like natural or internal or spiritual or mystical. I think it also relates to, and this is a second point, but it's very much connected to the first point. The second point is that Rav Soloveitchik lived in a time in America post the Holocaust where he was extremely thoughtful and extremely active in really developing an approach to what it means to be an Orthodox halachic Jew in America.
Exactly.
These were the years that were the height of the conservative movement, a time when the reform movement was spreading, and Rav Soloveitchik became a voice of how Jews can be shomer Torah and mitzvot and still respond to modernity in
Be
America.
American, yeah.
Yeah, but differently than the conservative and reform movement. Now, in order to do that, Rav Soloveitchik had to think and contend a lot with the different denominations, and he was therefore very focused on lines and boundaries and what is allowed in and what needs to be filtered and what we could ennoble and elevate and what we have to leave out. And I think the questions of what box are you in? Are you Orthodox? Are you conservative? Are you in? Are you out? We're front and center. And there was a constant need for differentiating and drawing red lines and understanding boundaries.
And that affected the whole American
to this
mindset.
Day.
It was interesting. When you said Rabbi Soloveitchik, originally I said I see Rabbi Soloveitchik's influence, but it's very gendered when you first mentioned it. I was thinking about my sisters. I don't think my sisters know anything about Rabbi. I mean, sorry if any of them are listening, but if I pulled my sister who lives in Woodmere, I love her. She's a wonderful Jew, an incredible mother, human being. I don't think she knows anything about Rabbi Soloveitchik. Genuinely. Like, it's just not her thing. But the way you articulate it, and it's very similar, but thinking about the categorization, the defining terms of brisk, and realizing that Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a way, created those categories sociologically in America. Importantly so, and defining a community of what it means to be a traditional Torah-observant Jew in America. You have to draw lines or you're going to get lost in the shuffle or total washout, which happened to nearly all American Jewry. As opposed to in Israel, and there's so many ways where this comes out, the boundaries, the sense of at any moment I could fall over the precipice and be lost to Jewish history is not there. The fear is not there, which can lead, and I think this is what you're saying, and we'll talk about it, it could lead to both an organic sense of I'm Jewish and I don't need to like be so hyper vigilant protective about it, and that could also probably lead to, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this is not a critical point, I want to be very careful.
No, what you're saying is so true.
But like a laxity in a way at times where like you don't feel like the minutia are necessary in order to preserve the core identity.
Right. The assimilation is not a concern in the same way. Intermarriage is certainly not, the same kind of worry or danger. And therefore, the entire community developed differently. And I think if we said on the one hand that Rav Soloveitchik was very focused on denominations and on lines and boundaries, Rav Kook did not have to think about that at all. But what he did think a lot about was chilonim, about secular Jews, and about their role in our redemption, whether they want to or think they're playing a role or not, about how to amplify our unity with them, even how to be makariv them. And he was not concerned with boundaries and lines and categorizing observance. He was much more focused on redemption, on kibbutz galiot. And I think that because of both of these points, the first 2 points, which are 2 different points, but they go together, and because of the strong influence of these figures, I think that when Americans, as you just described, come to Israel, they often feel that they can't necessarily describe it, that you did a great job of but they feel that there's something in the Dati Leumi community that feels to them less formal, something that feels more natural, more organic, more fluid. And for better or worse, people appear to be less caught up in the external trappings or less bound by the categories and boundaries and limitations that are often so defining to religious life in the diaspora. halacha. Now, I think what you said is exactly true, that part of it is because the fear of assimilation, intermarriage, being lost, totally, falling off from religion is not there. And therefore, it just gave a certain freedom kind of for things to develop in Israel. Now, it's not that halacha isn't important in Israel. Halacha is obviously crucially important, but I think halacha or the laws, they're not seen as the end point. They're not seen as the goal. They're seen as the starting point or the structure through which we develop and connect and have a spiritual relationship with our Judaism and with Hashem. Whereas sometimes in America, it feels almost like the observance or the keeping of halacha is the end goal.
Is it?
Yeah, is it. And just one more aspect of this that a friend of mine, I was talking to this morning, a friend of mine, Lori Novik, and she also really crystallized this point, which is that in Israel, the Sephardi Masorati community is very strong, and their voice is much more prominent than in many of the communities that we grew up in America. And they too come from a world without denominations. So in the Sephardi world, you have a huge amount of people who are traditional. They're even orthodox in their beliefs, let's say, even though they're not always observant and they don't always fit into the categories and boxes that Americans, for example, are used to. So many Sephardi women use the mikveh regularly and totally keep Taharat HaMishpacha, even though when you see them in terms of how they're dressed or at the beach on Shabbat, you wouldn't know that. Or I'll even give an example from last night. We had a family shavar brachot in a restaurant in Modi'in, and as we walked in, there was a young father with a Sephardi look, no kippah, jeans and t-shirt, walking out holding his daughter's hand. She was around 5-6 years old. And they were singing the song, Hashem Yiparach Tamid Ohevoti. Those were the words that they were singing. And it kind of captures it. It's this very spiritual, very connected to Hashem. I'm sure they think of themselves as Masorati. And yet they don't look the part that we would think of when we think of people who are religiously connected.
How do you talk to your students about this? Because when you have a student, if you try to bring that kind of American mentality to Israel, it can oftentimes be very frustrating. And if you try to bring the Israeli mentality to America, it can be extraordinarily frustrating.
Yeah.
I've taught it specifically in Stern and specifically among women in America, from women in their 20s. If you would draw a pie chart of how they self-identify or how they express their frumkeit, their externals of how they dress is a major part of it, and it's far less in Israel. So I want to get to those serious issues, but please continue because you have a list.
I just have one more point to make in terms of these underlying differences that I see between the world of Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, is that while they both cared very, very deeply about Knesset Yisrael, the collective of Am Yisrael, and they both cared very, very deeply about the individual's personal relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God, I do think that they had different focuses. Rav Soloveitchik is more focused on the individual. That was at the center of his religious experience. What is an individual's connection with God? Even in his writings, think of halachic man, lonely man of faith. It's what is a person's personal connection to his faith, to his God? Rav Kook, because of his Zionism, because of his deep connection to the land, to Eretz Yisrael, plus, to the people, kind of, as we spoke about before, of Am Yisrael, of Chilonim, he puts a lot more emphasis on the collective, on the klal, and on what it means that we have Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, headed towards Geula, headed towards redemption, and what that means in our lives. And I think even though in Israel today, there has been a move to put more emphasis on the individual, I still think there is a difference in the lived experience when you're part of a Dati Leumi community in Israel, of what a big role the kind of collective or your connection to the Medina and to the Am plays in your religious experience. And I think, as we move forward and we talk about some of the concrete differences, I think when you keep these three things in mind, the categorizing and the analysis versus the more the pnim and the internal and the mystical and whatever, you keep in mind the denominations versus the more of the general view in terms of a nation, and you keep this point in mind, I do think they help explain. Again, even if someone like your sister can't put it into words, I do think they help explain a lot of what we sometimes see around us. And when you talk about how do I talk to my students, one of the things that I love about teaching in Migdal Oz. Migdal Oz, by the way, for people that don't know, is the Beit Midrash that's the sister school for Yeshivat Har Tzion, which people often are more familiar with Gush. It's the women's division, and it's completely an Israeli institution, but every year there's around 30 overseas students, what we call Benot Chol, who come and they're completely integrated into the Israeli Beit Midrash, as opposed to Gush, where they have more like their own separate program. Here they're completely integrated, but they do have extra support. They have some figures like me who grew up like them, who teach some classes here and there in English. But part of the reason that I've had so much time to think about these issues is because I'm living it every day. I teach a room that has Israeli students. I teach mostly in Hebrew, Israeli students and American students. And even for me, when I first got there, I'm like, what is going on here? Like the dress and the way people talk and so many things that for me felt foreign or different. And it took me a while to really, and together with my husband, Judah, to really like be able to put into words a lot of the things that I'm talking about, but it came out of my lived experience.
It's absolutely crucial because you mentioned his name, and I have not mentioned this officially in relationship to us, but it is absolutely crucial that I do mention that Judah Goldberg, your husband, who's absolutely wonderful, is my third cousin. Right?
Yeah.
Is that
Yes.
right? That's absolutely
and
crucial.
And he teaches with your
like
sister, Alana, in MMY.
in MMY. So I feel like we are mashgicha here. We're really family here. But I'm so fascinated because as opposed to my sister's experience at MMY, which is a deeply American program, your program is very like if the Israelis and Americans are fully integrated, which is not true of any American men's program. Even as you said, Gush, like they're more separate, the Israelis and Americans. In
they're in the same Beit Midrash and they do interact more than I think in some of the other yeshivot.
Do they room together?
My students do.
Your students do room.
They room together, and we'll talk about Shana Ba'ar's programs, but yeah, I have a lot to say about like these things because I also taught in American Shana Ba'ar's programs, and my husband does, and my sister does, and my cousins do.
That's what I want to spend a little bit of time on because we don't really talk about it. There are different names that are used for it, whether it's Shana Ba'aretz or Gap Year or My Year in Israel. But there is a widespread movement that people from America, primarily from the modern Orthodox community, spend a year in Israel or sometimes two, rarely, but sometimes three after high school, right? In the yeshiva community, they do it a little bit later. They don't do it right after high school. In the modern Orthodox community, we send them right after high school.
Well, the women in the yeshiva community do come after high school.
Oh, that's true. Correct. So my question is, like, what do you see as, like, the key differences between that seminary year, what it is in the minds of the Americans, and what is it for the Israelis? Like, It's so interesting because they come in for such different things. Americans, there's this notion of getting more religious, of flipping out, and all of these things, which are, to my mind, I think are American. Are they also things that we have in Israel of people flipping out in their year in Midrash? What are the differences?
Okay, I will explain that to you. If I could just first touch on like one other broader point, because I think this also connects into like the religious culture and the flipping out or whatever, which is that based on all the things I said earlier, because it's a little pie in the sky. Like I spoke about 3 conceptual ideas, but I do want to just give a concrete expression of like the things that I said in terms of the differences, and this will lead into the midrashot and the seminaries. When I think about all the things that I said that are defining to the different communities, I think what it means is that you could understand why in a community that's more focused on towing the line and on defining boundaries, people could feel more boxed in. Like they could feel, and you speak about this often on your podcast, like they could feel, that they're on the derech or they're off of it or they're firm or they're not really firm or they're legit and they're the real thing or no, they're not. Sometimes in that more categorized society, it could feel more binary. And then the challenge can manifest in people either not feeling like they have room to express themselves religiously, to deviate at all from like the very strong community standards. And that could be in Williamsburg or that could be in Teaneck or that could be in Great.
For sure.
Where I grew up.
Yes.
Each one in their own way. And that could really push people away, and be like, I can't breathe, I'm suffocating. Or if they choose to stay, as so many people do, thank God, the challenge sometimes is how to help them connect on a deeper level, beyond just checking off the halakhic boxes or beyond just meeting the community standards, how to help them feel and develop a personal relationship with Hashem and with their Judaism that feels authentic and is not just external, or as you like to say, not just, recreating the Judaism of the 80s or the 90s that we grew up in. And that's the challenge, I think, a lot of times in the communities in America. Whereas in Israel, it's like the challenge is exactly the opposite. In Israel, as you said, where the trend is to see more and more of what they call here a retzef, a continuum of religious observance, where each person is
say that word again.
Retzef. Yeah, retzef means a continuum.
And they use that word colloquially to refer to
the retzef Dati, like the religious continuum. And where are you on the retzef? Where are you on the spectrum, basically, on the religious spectrum?
The retzef Dati. I love learning new terminology. Yeah. Is that a real term that people use?
The retzef Dati means the religious spectrum. And it's like there's a huge religious spectrum in Israel where literally everyone's kind of doing their own thing. So this one, she dresses like that, but she davens 3 times a day. And this one, she's like this and like that. And you're like, are any two people here in the same box? Kind of sometimes feels like not. So it's much less boxy. It's much more fluid. It's much less focused on external standards. Israelis, by the way, in general, like to be zorim. Zorim means like they like to flow. They like to be like laid back or chill, as my students would say. So while there's certainly like a strong and natural spirituality in the air in Israel, the challenge could be how to help people understand that we believe that halacha and living life within certain parameters and boundaries is a deeply meaningful and significant part of spiritual development itself and of a connection to Hashem. And Rav Amital, the founder of Yeshivat Har Zion, would often talk about how the young people of this country struggle sometimes to feel committed when they feel like, but I don't connect and I don't feel that connection. He's like, no, you still have to be connected even if you don't feel it. It's different challenges. Here people feel very connected and very mechubar, as they say, and very almost like in a personal relationship with God. And again, they value halacha, but it's like, whereas in America, I feel like you'll have very, very, very halachic people, but sometimes, they're like, I'm not feeling it, or I'm just doing it because that's what I need to do. And then when I take that into the seminary experience of how Israeli midrashot run versus American seminaries, I think we really see that. So the first thing is something very basic, but very, very significant, which is the seminary year for Americans, which is also known as a Shana Ba'aretz, a year in Israel, means you're a whole year away from home in a different country, in Israel, in a totally different environment. So even though there are educators today in these programs who lament the fact that students really aren't disconnected enough and they're too connected to their smartphones and they're too in touch with their parents and they're on FaceTime all the time and WhatsApp. And it's true. I mean, at the end of the day, these young women and men are still very far from their homes and from their parents for an entire year, and they're not interacting with them in person, which means that these programs, these yeshivot and these seminaries, they present a real opportunity for independence and for development, for thinking through on my own. Who am I as my own person? Do I want to be exactly like my parents? Do I want to grow differently? Do I want a different hashkafa? It also presents a real opportunity for growing up, for learning how to clean up after yourself, for getting around on public transportation, for doing laundry that some of these kids are doing for the first time, for making Shabbos plans on your own. But I have to say, given that I'm in an Israeli midrasha, when you look sometimes at the Shana Ba'aretz program from outside, you realize how much that growth is happening in like a vacuum, like in a closed off environment. It's like you're working so hard on your midot, and how often does it happen that people come home, they're back their first day from their year in Israel, or their Shabbos, and they get into a huge fight with their mom, and then they're like, well, what was that work on my midot for the year? Right, it doesn't come out when you're interacting with your host for Shabbos. It was your mom who triggers all your, buttons or whatever, or you change your dress, let's say, and then you come home and your whole closet of clothing that you didn't take with you to seminary is right there waiting for you, and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot about all these clothing. And then we have the flipping out and then flipping back, whereas there's something I think that is more challenging, but I think also healthier about the Israeli experience of midrashot or yeshivot, which is that it's, for better or worse, a much more integrated experience.
With their home lives.
Yeah, they go home.
Community.
They go home every other Shabbos, or they see their friends who are not in their midrasha or in their yeshiva. And therefore, there's a lot of growth, but the growth happens in a way that's more connected to who they were and where they're from. Hashem. It's not as intense. I think sometimes there's something maybe more healthy about it. I think educators can't just like use guilt or fear to like flip people out. They have to work with people in their environment. In Migdal Uz, we talk a lot about bringing your home to the Beit Midrash, bringing the Beit Midrash to your home. We have, events where we invite the parents. The parents know the educators. It's not like I sent my kid off, and other than the yeshiva week that I came to visit them, I really have no idea what's being said to them and what they're hearing and what's being told. So I think that's a very basic but actually very significant difference in just like the makeup of the programs. And then beyond that, I think obviously every seminary is different, every yeshiva is different, but I do think that I could highlight, like, I thought about three real differences that kind of parallel the things that I spoke earlier. Okay, the first one is
Tell me.
Yeah, in American seminaries, there's a lot of emphasis on the concrete, on the quantifiable, on the text you study, on developing skills, on analyzing sources, on thinking rationally, on delving deeply into an idea, or even on like, what farm are you learning? What halachot are you taking on? What are you being messiahing? It's basically that more litfish, more rational, more concrete, defined, and grounded part of Judaism. Whereas in Israeli midrashot, you notice that strong emphasis on spirituality. When I arrived in Migdal Uz and I heard terms like olam ruchani, or safa ruchani, what's your religious world, or what's your religious language? I'm like, what are they talking about? There's so much talk about developing your inner religious world.
What is meant by a safa ruchani, a religious language?
Safa ruchanit is like the language through which you think about who you are as a religious person, the language through which you talk about Hashem or talk about the world. How much do you talk about Hashem?
Gotcha.
There's a lot of focus on tefillah. In Israeli midrashot, there's a lot of intense, soulful singing, but not like, it comes this in American midrashah where like maybe you sing a song once or twice and then you move on to the next song. It's like they'll sing the same song for like a good 10 minutes, over and over of like, I want to feel this song and I want to connect to the words and I want it to like change me or move me or do something to me. There's also a lot of reflection that goes on in Israeli midrashot. Like students are always being asked to reflect on the topics they learn. How does that make you feel? Which pasuk in the David Hashem do you connect to? I remember when Americans come to the Migdal Uz, and Migdal Uz is known as a very intellectual place that's very, high level, and people are very smart and bright. And then like on the first day, it's Elul, someone gives them the parak of the David Hashem, and instead of saying, analyze the parak, divide it up, read the mefarshim, it's like, read the parak, which pasuk speaks to you? Which pasuk moves something in you? What? Like, it's not the way they think of learning Torah. And the teacher, will often let the conversation go in the direction that the students take it. I'll always tell students coming to Migdal Uz, if you want to just fill notebooks of information, then this isn't the place for you. If you want to, grow and learn and reflect and really come out, really connected to Hashem and your Judaism and to halacha and to learning, it's great. But if you want to just, write, because then they get there with their pen and their notebook and they're like, wait, but people are just talking and sharing. I
taught one semester in Stern, and I remember I could tell who the top serious seminary women are, because in my first class, I don't even think I opened up my mouth, but they were all waiting there with their pen and their notebook. And I actually told the class, I said, no laptops, close everything. Let's talk.
Yeah,
Let's
see,
converse.
You and Jude are definitely related, because you always said to them, everyone put down your pens and stop writing. We're just, yeah. So I think, that difference of emphasis and focus. Another big difference that I feel when it comes to women's Torah learning in Israel is that the Dati Leumi community in Israel is not looking over its shoulder in both directions, meaning the Dati Leumi community is strong and it stands on its own. And it's not afraid of being judged by the more right-wing Haredi world. There's not the sense of we're the not authentic Jews, or we're the Jews that compromise, or we're not the ones who are serious and passionate. Zafka Dati Leumi Jews sometimes feel what do you mean? We are learning and serving and protecting our country. We're the real, Jews. There's a confidence in their approach. And on the other side, so they're not looking over their shoulder at Haredim. And on the other side, the question of denominations is not really relevant here in the same way. And therefore, that fear of if somehow we empower women, we're going to be labeled as not being Orthodox also doesn't exist. So I think that's a big reason why in Israel, women's Torah learning, like in Migdaluz, in Matan, in Nishmad, in Drish, like it's really taken off because there's not this fear of like somehow if women learn seriously, that means we're conservative. Or if we have religious roles for women, like yoetzet halacha, who are trained in Hilchot Nida, a program that I did, or Toanot Beitin to help with the laws of divorce, or Rabbaniot. There's a lot of Rabbaniot who are community leaders. It's not like, oh no, now that means that you're reform. And also, and I've also heard you talk about this, I also think because we're not looking over our shoulder, it's also the reason why I think there's been new approaches to learning and thinking in Torah that have come out of Israel. You know, in Tanakh, like Herzog, in Gemara, and Machshava, there's an openness and a creativity because people aren't worried about being judged by the Haredim, oh no, we're not from. Or they're not worried about being thought of as all of a sudden we're not Orthodox.
But let me ask you this, because I agree, especially post October 7th, I have seen the Dati Leumi kind of step into its sociological leadership role. I look at them as leading the Jewish people at this point. The level of sacrifice, the level of commitment, the people who are burying family members who died al Kiddush Hashem, who are immersed in Torah learning. I don't sense any insecurity vis-a-vis the Haredi world. But allow me, and maybe I'm wrong, is there any insecurity vis-a-vis American Judaism? Meaning, when American Jews look at the Dati Leumi community, and I wouldn't say into trouble, but I had some very real conversations about this because one time when I was talking about these differences, there were listeners who affiliated with that Dati Leumi community who felt that I was being critical of the religiosity in the community, which God forbid is not at all the case. But I was kind of surprised at how a conversation like this could sometimes be interpreted as being critical. And I do sometimes feel an insecurity vis-a-vis Americans. And I understand it much better, where the community that should be the most supportive of their work and their model and what they do ultimately sends their kids to Israel for Shana Ba'aretz, and most programs, they come back and they're more distant from the Dati Leumi community because the rules of religiously thriving in America are very different in Israel. And they can sometimes look with a little bit of, and I am just as guilty of this as anyone else, but you can sometimes look without the esteem that I think the community deserves, without the heroics, and say, well, you know, you're not as frum, you're not as committed, you know, because halachically, the culture of halacha is different in both places. Have you experienced insecurity vis-a-vis Americans, the American Orthodox community?
Only by Olim. Israelis for better. Yeah, Israelis for better or worse. I know it's very hard for Americans, you know, sometimes to hear this. They don't really care what's going on in America. They don't even think it's relevant. One of the things that I have to say to Israelis is you need to care what's going on in the diaspora. You need to care, you know, about like things that are playing out in Jewish communities around the world. They're also part of Knesset Yisrael. And that's very eye-opening for the Israelis in Migdaluz to, let's say, meet the Americans and realize, whoa, there's like really serious Jewish life outside of Israel. And like that spurs a lot of thinking on their part. But most Israelis, they are not at all thinking about what's going on. Like, I mean, classic Dati Leumi Israelis are not thinking about what Americans think of them. Olim, I think, because they're somewhere between the two
people
worlds.
Who made Aliyah, they were born in the diaspora, born in America,
and they have to answer to their old neighbors or to their, you know, relatives, their siblings who come for Pesach and see your kids. And why is your kid in a t-shirt and jeans when they're in high school? That shouldn't they be in a button-down shirt? And what kind of dress is this? And how could they come to shul, you know, looking like that?
Have you experienced that ever?
I think all of them experience that tension of like where you came from versus where you are now, and how much you want to impose the values of the culture that you came from. This is true about any immigrant, you know, culture. How much you want to incorporate or impose the values of the culture that you came from onto your children. You know, children will often say to their parents, you chose to move me here. Now let me be here, you know, but it's like, you're like, okay, but I chose to move you here, but that doesn't mean that I think that everything everything about Israeli culture is holy or better. I think there's a lot that Olim have to contribute to life here, to the conversation, to values here.
For you, religiously, what is the biggest difference in your family life? Not as a teacher, but as a person, as a mother, as a spouse, as an individual. What do you think was the biggest difference you experienced after making Aliyah?
There's a number, but one of them really goes back to that focus on the klal versus on the individual, which is that in America, I have 4 boys and a daughter, okay? And like my sons, thank God, like they're very serious about their Limud Torah and about whatever. But in Israel, the really good kids in Israel are the kids who are like volunteering to be mashgichim in Bnei Akiva and who are working, after school at Shalva with special needs kids and who are helping the elderly neighbors and building the sukkahs for free. And if you're a kid who's like just wants to like sit and learn, that's not the culture of what is.
It's not the hierarchy almost of like what we're striving for.
It's not, so like in America where it's like, oh, if you're a serious boy in high school, you'll go to Morsha Kollel or to NCSY Kollel. Here it's like, well, like you're just like kind of like invested in your own learning and development. Like, why aren't you out there like giving to the klal? Why aren't you out there contributing? And I know we come from a culture, and especially the high school culture in America, like when I go to recruit and I see not just like the Torah opportunities, but the STEM labs, I'm like, I wish our kids had these things. That's been very hard. And learning how to just kind of like let go. And again, my kids, thank God, they're all seriously involved with Talmud Torah. But I know it looks different than it would probably look at if they were in MTA or TABC or DRS or wherever they would have been in America. And I think the way they dress is different. The way they look is a little different.
Do they dress differently when you're in America? Do you or any of your family members change your dress when you visit America?
We're definitely aware. First of all, my high school boys, like they wear t-shirts, but they're not in like a grungy look or like they're a mix. They're really a mix of the culture we come from and the culture that they're in. But no, they are who they are, and all kids of Olim, they struggle. I remember one time on a trip to America, we were in Boca where my brother-in-law, is the rabbi, and it's a place that we feel comfortable. My in-laws live there, and my son said to me, why is it that in Israel I feel so American? And then we come to America and I feel so Israeli. And I think that's true. I think a lot of Olim children and even adults, like it's weird for me to realize, hey, I'm not really American anymore. Like when I'm in America or I speak to my American friends, I realize, wow, I've been here a long time. And even the things I was talking about before, like they've evolved, they've shifted. I'm not totally in that like Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Lichtenstein total place anymore.
What's the reminder when you're in America and you're speaking to friends that you are like, wow, I've been in Israel for quite some time?
The things that our kids are involved in and up to and doing, the independence of our children here.
But what about you peer to peer, like the women who you went to high school with, the women who you grew up with?
There's a whole world that I've been exposed to, amygdalos, that more spiritual world, that it's very hard for my friends, even my most serious friends and my most learned friends in America, the world of Rav Dov Zinger and Makor Chaim and the world of the singing.
Former 1840, yes.
Yeah, and the Migdalos Slichot, and it's a huge part of who I am at this point and of the way that I connect to Hashem, even connect to learning.
Let's talk about some of the other practical differences, and I know there must be a major difference, and I specifically, so much of this conversation is almost always about men. Mm-hmm. It's a very gendered conversation, and it's a very high stakes conversation, specifically as it relates to men. I want to talk specifically about the differences as you're talking about. We spoke about midrashot and seminary. How Israeli women think about the army and Sheirut Leumi.
Such an important question.
Usually this topic is considered in the context of, Haredi versus Dati Leumi, who's serving, who's not serving. That's not the conversation I want to have right now. The conversation I want to have right now, because I know so little about it, and I think most modern Orthodox Americans know very little about it, which is what is the decision-making process, the sorting of the hats of how women think about serving in the army versus Sheirut Leumi, and the effect that has on their religiosity, on their their lives. Like, we know a lot of very, very, very frum men who serve in combat units. Mm-hmm. Is that something women do in the Dati Leumi community? Is it something they're discouraged from, but some do, some don't? Tell me a little bit about how this factor influences the religious character of Israel.
I'm so happy that you're asking this and that there's a platform to talk about this, because as you said, I really think most people, including, again, my closest friends, really do not have any insight into this topic of women and the army. If they know anything, they know that, aren't religious women not really supposed to go to the army, and that's what they know. So I'll try to explain it from the vantage point that I see it. In the Dati Leumi community that I'm a part of, religious women do both go to the army and do shivut leumi. Now, for many, many, many years, many religious women did not go to the army because it was thought of as a very religiously challenging environment for women to be in. But that has really changed over the last decade or so, and many more serious, committed, from halachic, religious young women have been drafting. Now, it's definitely still not the go-to in large segments of the community, but even in those circles, even let's say in the most Shamrani, which is like small C conservative girls' high school, there's always going to be a few seniors that decide they're going to the army. And it's just not looked down upon in the way that it once was, or I'll say it certainly doesn't carry the same kind of taboo.
There's a history to the taboo. There were massive battles and lines drawn over specifically women and the draft. And the strongest language that I know generally you don't look over your shoulder and look at the Haredi community, but this was really happening when the communities were not as distant from one another in the 1950s or whenever this was happening, in the late 40s and 50s. But there was this sense, and the term that people used, and I hope it's okay I'm saying this, is that even Shirut Leumi, any type of participation for women, is yehareg va'al yavor. It is better to give up your life rather than be under the dominion and supervision of an army.
To this day, the Haredi world, Haredi women certainly didn't go to the army, and they don't do shivut leumi because they don't want to be in environments that they don't have control over. They don't want to be in foreign places, and they don't want to have to answer to other people, not even the army, even if they're working in a home for children or they're working with special needs. They don't want to lose that ability to shelter their young people from those influences. So that is true in the Haredi world.
So in the Dati Leumi world, why do you think that taboo, which was, you said it was a taboo for many years, why do you think that taboo has dissipated?
Okay, so all citizens of this country, including women, are obligated to go to the army. It's not as I thought before I made Aliyah, that a religious woman has two tracks offered to her. She could either do the army or shivut leumi. People don't realize this. Every woman, as she approaches the end of high school, she's going to receive her tzav rishon. Also, Haredi women, every man, every woman is going to receive their tzav rishon, their draft, their call up to the army. Now, if you as a woman don't want to draft, you need to go down to the enlistment office and you need to be matir. You need to formally declare that I am religious and therefore I'm not comfortable going to the army. And then you have to ask for that obligation to be waived.
So you have to opt out.
You have to opt out, exactly. Now, once it's waived, you could then say, well, I also want to contribute. I'll do national service. But it's not that then you have to do shivut leumi. Once it's waived, if you want to go right to university, you could do that. Meaning that's how the system is right now.
I'm going to be honest, I had no idea.
Exactly. I didn't know either until I moved here. You just thought, religious women could, right.
I thought the Shirut Leumi was like the Chesed division of the army. That's what I thought. It was
not
like
at all.
It was like the helping part of the army.
No, and it's not. It's simple experience to go down to the enlistment office, and I'll get to that in a minute.
We have to define it. I'm so sorry we didn't do this earlier. Shirut Leumi
is national service.
National service.
And that's why I wanted to explain what that is. National service means that after high school, a religious girl who feels that it's not comfortable for her to go to the army could get that, waived. And then she could decide to do a year, or it's very popular now to do 2 years of national service, which means that many girls will go straight from high school. Some will do a year of midrashah first. Some will do a year of midrashah afterwards. But Shevut Leumi in this country is very, very, very important and very valuable, meaning there's a lot of institutions that wouldn't be able to run if not for their Shevut girls, which means that these Shevut women, they work very, very hard in different areas. Now, some work with special needs children, some work with the elderly, some work with children from broken homes who live in orphanages like Amit or like Beit el-Israqi, and they're living with them and they're doing their homework with them and they're helping them get dressed in the morning and they're eating with them. And some work in hospitals, some work in rehab centers, some become tour guides in places like Ir David or Har Herzl or Yad Vashem or the Old City. Some work in offices like Nefesh B'Nefesh or even in the Prime Minister's office. There's even now a lot of security roles that Shevut Leumi women could do. And some work in schools or in underprivileged communities. Some work in youth movements. There's a lot of options. And a woman could say, wow, what are my talents? What are my strengths? Where can I contribute? And then she'll go, and she often works very hard, very long hours. There's not necessarily always like a lot of emotional support for her. And it's also hard because she doesn't always get the same public respect and admiration because she doesn't have a uniform. So it's not like you see, you don't know who those Shevut women are. And yet they are keeping this country going and they're doing very, very meaningful things. So that's the Shevut option. Why I think the army has become less taboo is because many young women, they feel uncomfortable going into that office and declaring that because I'm a Datiya, I can't go to the army because I'm not comfortable for religious reasons, when A, that's the default and everyone's supposed to do it, and other populations aren't given that opt-out option. But also today, a lot of my students feel like, how can I declare that when it's not really true? You could be a religious woman in the army today because so many more religious women are going and because all of the important accommodations are in place, meaning the kosher food and the Shabbos and the time to daven and also the bases that are much more friendly to religious women. And therefore, when a woman, like even sometimes when she thinks, maybe I'd be really great at this Shevut Leumi place, maybe I'd be really valuable, maybe it would even be more meaningful and significant for me. But if everyone's supposed to go to the army, how could I not go? Similar to how people talk about Haredim. Now, this way of thinking has been trending over the last decade in the Dati Leumi community, but
has it caused hand-wringing? Are there communal conversations like, should we be pushing up against this? Should we be encouraging this further?
Yes.
How does it divide out? Has it caused, I mean, I hope not like massive divisions, but are there figures that represent both sides of these views?
Yeah, in the more open Dati Leumi world, like in the Gush Etzion world, it's already very, very mainstream to go to the army. It's also very mainstream to not go and to do Shevut Leumi. They're kind of like two options, pretty equal. Maybe, definitely in a time of war, women are feeling more and more like, but I have to go to the army. But Shevut Leumi is also definitely very much respected. In parts of the Dati Leumi community that tend to be more conservative, it's much more controversial. And there were high schools that used to say, like, if you go to the army, we will not accept any of your sisters to the school. That has more or less fallen away in most high schools because it's changing at such a rate that you can't really say that anymore.
Just who are the institutions and figures associated with the more lowercase c conservative part of the Dati Leumi world? Just to put some names and institutions to, you said from Migdal Oz, we know a lot about that world. Who do we associate with the more conservative? Are you comfortable just giving these names?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm comfortable because, you don't
want to misspeak or miscategorize.
Yeah, unless I heard someone speak. I mean, first of all, there's a whole Chardal world, the whole more Haredi Dati Leumi world, which is the more what they call the Kavnikim yeshivot, the yeshivot that are connected to Har Hamor and Midrashat Harova, the Israeli side Midrashat Harova. They are very not into the army. They're very public. Har Hamor and Midrashat Harova on the Israeli side, which is different than the American side. So I feel comfortable, saying them, but there's a whole lot of people. I would say probably most of the Hesder yeshivot that you're familiar with that Americans go to, I would imagine that their Rosh Yeshiva are probably not very supportive of women going to the army. And I want to say even in Yeshivat Har Tzion, even in Migdal Oz, we are okay with women going to the army. We support it. We don't push it because it's very delicate. It really has to be the right thing for a specific young woman. We have what's called a garin in Migdalos, which means that women come to the midrasha and then they could go into the army in groups together, kind of a little bit like Hesder. They continue to be in touch with Migdalos. They come back for Shabbatot. The faculty goes to visit them on their bases. We're very in touch with them. They get a lot of support, but it's not necessarily the right thing for everyone. And even though in the war, it's gained much more traction because our existence really feels at stake and our lives are on the line. And there's so many idealistic young women who want to contribute. And it's amazing the things that they're doing. Like many of them are in intelligence jobs, which are basically J jobs, more or less, like 8 to 5, 8 to 6 with a night shift here or there, weekend shift here or there. But they're doing things like at the age of, 19, 20, where it's like they're directing the rescue planes into Gaza, or they're helping plan the missions of the soldiers, or they're collecting information on terrorists, or they're involved in coding really amazing things.
It's otherworldly to think about.
It's unbelievable.
To split screen between what a 18-year-old, 19-year-old woman would be doing in the Five Towns or Boca, God bless them, and they're doing wonderful things, and the split screen of what a woman from the same, religious universe would be doing in Israel. It's kind of jaw-dropping.
Yeah, and she could do it all in a skirt with totally kosher food, not being Mechalel Shabbos. And there's a lot more attention today also about boundaries in terms of if they're doing a certain exercise in basic training, can they, do it in a completely separate area away from if there's any men, or there's a lot more awareness of those things since more and more religious women have gone to the army.
I was going to ask you about that because you initially did not include it on your list, and I noticed that it was absent. You just mentioned it now, and that is the male-female interaction, sexuality in the army. You have an army of people who are away from their families, communities, girlfriends, whatever it is, and they are now working in a very different environment. They're now working side by side with women. Right. And there's some ugliness, some polemical ugliness to this that I think some people made it out or would criticize the army and women in the army specifically around this issue as a cautionary tale of why you shouldn't go into the army. But I don't want to just gloss over and say, oh, now they can do, their basic training a mile away or a few feet away. What is your sense of women being able to preserve, like having healthy relationships in that context of the army? It's an otherworldly context. You're not living a normal life. And I could imagine that the struggles as it relates to sexuality, inappropriate touch, all of these things can be infinitely harder for a religious woman working within an army than a religious woman who's working in an office where there's an HR department. I mean, there's just HR in the army too. How do you address this? Do you think that's a real issue in the army?
The question is a very good one and an important one. And it's true basically for any woman or man who's in a non-combat job. So like if you're a man in yeshiva, in a Hesder yeshiva, and you're going in with the Hesder guys to combat, you're going to be just with your other friends from yeshiva and with other men. But my son, for example, who couldn't be combat, I have a son in the army right now. He's what's called a mashgicha. He's a social worker in the army. He's on the Dati base, and he's actually a social worker right now for Haredi soldiers in what's called the Tomer unit of Dati, which means he's in charge of overseeing all of their personal needs. And let me tell you, in the Haredi unit, there's many, because it's very complicated relationships usually with their parents, and they can't always go home, and he has to make sure they have a place to live and they have, where to go, and it's not simple stuff. But his office, it's him and 2 other men and 13 women are the social workers on that base. So coming from, 2 years of Yeshiva Har Tzion and then working with mostly Chiloni women was a very big change for him. And that's going to be true for any man or woman who's in any kind of just job, whether it is an intelligence job, whether it is a foreign relations job, whether it is an educational job, whether it is, besides foreign relations, there's also like public relations in terms of like internal things to Israel. There's all kinds of things in the army, and it is things that I think anyone who's going into those areas needs to have a lot of conversations about boundaries and about what their lines are and what's appropriate. But I would differ with what you're saying is that it's not so different than working in an office in America, meaning if you're in a secular workplace, in terms of like, you have to learn how to navigate the language. Like my son's colleagues, like they they know him well, and they're careful with their language around him. And the opportunities actually for Kiddush Hashem are vast. Like, he made a siyum recently, Masechet Bechorot.
Wow.
He didn't want to do it to his soldiers. He wanted to do it for his colleagues. And he said to them, I'm not going to water down Torah for you like people often do for Chilonim. I respect you and you're intelligent. I'm going to share with you the meat of Torah. And obviously he did it in a way that they could understand. But he said those opportunities for dialogue are part of what makes the army experience very, very powerful for people. Like, you'll often see that people invite their Chiloni army friends, to their wedding. But obviously the same as going to secular college, the same as going off to an office job, you need to be cautious. You need to have guidance. There's very strict harassment rules and things like that in the army. So like that part is like very in check. There's very strict rules about who you could date, or, like that part I think is actually more in check than in an office or on a secular campus. But for a yeshiva guy or a midrashah, young woman who's maybe not used to being in that environment, it is very different. And you could understand why Haredim, if they are going to join the army, want to have closed units where that's not going to be part of what they have to encounter.
Let's go to what I think is one of the most stark differences. We've touched on it before, which is the issue of modesty. Tznius in America, tznius is the Hebrew word for modesty. It refers to a way of life, but colloquially, it is usually in reference to how people dress. Even though every tznius book begins with, this is not about how people dress, it's usually just the first page that says that, and the rest is, but this is how you should dress. Tznius is very different for women in particular in America and in Israel. Very, very different. I want to be as brief as possible in presenting my question. Number one, I am a man, so tznius issues, even though on that first page, after they say that tznius is not just about dress, they also say right in the second paragraph is, and tznius is not just for women, it's also for men. And then the next 800 pages or the next hour is, and here the dress code for women. So with that caveat, tznius, as it is colloquially used to refer to the dress of women, the dress is very, very different. And I would like you to talk about how that really shapes the religiosity and the differences between America and Israel.
Yeah, it's a big deal because it's something that people notice right away, because it's so like in your face and external, and because Olim who come here, and I was literally at a wedding the other night and someone said to me, I don't know if I'm ever going to get used to this, and I've already been here X number of years, so.
But what were they noticing? What were they reacting to at that wedding?
The difference in the dress and the style and the standards. And also at the wedding, they were noticing the difference in like weddings in America are so formal. And
oh my goodness.
You don't hear a pin drop, if you're at a wedding where people are quiet. And in Israel, there's so much energy and there's so much singing, and it's such a different vibe and feeling. So, okay, I see two main underlying differences. One goes back to what I described earlier, which is that the focus of the religious world here in Israel is much more on the internal than the external. So of course the external matters, but it is not the main thing. So if people in America talk about how, the central, most important and defining mitzvah for women is tzniut, you do not hear that talk in the same way, at least in the Dati Leumi circles that I am a part of in Israel. I'm sure in the Haredi community that is not true. I'm sure in parts of the Chardal community. Now, of course, tzniut is spoken about, and it's halacha, and it's taught, and that's actually what I teach in Migdalos. But you will often hear people talking about what's the deeper meaning, what's the mashma'ut behind it. And when I teach these halachot to Israelis, I'm teaching the sources from the inside. And for many of them, it's the first time that somebody opened up for them the halacha in that very real, concrete way. They've had a lot of conversations about the meaning and the importance or whatever, but not in that way. And I think that less focus on externals, which could go back to even Rav Kook, even though, as you said, a person today living in Israel is not going to think that's why. But
correct.
I really do think it's all connected. But I also think that it goes together with the fact that the culture in the Dati Leumi community in general in Israel is not a very materialistic one. It's much less fancy. It's much more casual. It's much simpler. And it could go back to the roots of the the chalutzim and the pioneers and kibbutzim or whatever. I don't know.
Socialist.
Yeah, that's socialist. Like, yeah, we're just simple and we're here to work the land and we don't care. I don't know if it goes past that, but I do know that in general, there's just so much less emphasis on dress. Before I even get into the religious halachic part, there's so much less emphasis on dress. I mean, what people are wearing day to day, like nobody cares. Or even on Shabbos, or even to weddings, like you spoke about in that other podcast. Like no one really cares. They don't care how new your clothes are, and they don't care if they're this season, and they don't care if you're a man and you're wearing jeans and t-shirt. Even real B'nai Torah in yeshiva could be dressed in that casual way, or someone could come to shul in shorts. And that formality and dignity of dress that I grew up with in America, it's missing here in that way, and it could be very, very hard for Americans to adjust to. And many, including myself, I don't want to adjust to that, 100%, because I think there's value in how we present ourselves. So while I could appreciate, and I really do appreciate that, like, it's like, just come to the wedding. I don't care how you come. I don't care what you're wearing. I want you there, and I want your energy, and I want your spirit. And there's something so beautiful about the fact that people aren't caught up in the external trappings, and there's like so much less pressure that's not about the show and whatever. And on the other hand, like, there's also something that sometimes makes something more mechubad, or like brings honor and brings a seriousness, or dress really affects the reason we all get dressed up on Shabbos, and the reason that the Shabbos table feels different than the dinner table during the week is partly because of how we come dressed to it. So I do think that's the first point, that you have to understand that in Israel, before I even get to the halachic piece, which I'm going to speak about in a second, it's just like, I don't know, the culture is really different. And I'll even say my mother came with me last week when Simchat Torah ended here. There was Hakafot Shniyot in Migdal Luz, and it's a really beautiful event, and hundreds of women come to it. And afterwards, when I was talking to her about it, and we were talking about, the dancing and how moving, whatever, she's like, but you know what else I noticed? There was no food. She's like, there was no spread. No one put out sushi or wings, or not even soda, not even store-bought cookies. Like, everyone just came for the event, which was to dance. There's something that's also beautiful about that. And I think, like, when Americans come and they're so quick to judge, you have to also understand that flip side, meaning I'm with them, I understand it, but you also have to understand there's a beauty that comes along with that. And I think there's also just the cultural norms that we spoke about earlier in America, which are like so strong and which people feel so kind of sometimes boxed into, like they're just different in Israel. So it's not like all women are in a pencil skirt and flats, like it's just the dress is more colorful. It literally is more colorful. There's more styles. The styles are often looser and like more flowy. There's also like, women could be wearing blundstones, or they could be wearing sneakers, or they could be wearing sandals. And like, it's just, I don't know, there's a lot more options, and like kind of people don't really care. So that's the first point. And the second point, the second really big difference, is that there's a range of different poskim, different big rabbinic figures in Israel that are turned to and are relied on in our communities here in Israel that really have different psakim, different rulings about dress. Now, these are very big, chashuv, solid rabbanim. People like Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, people like Rav Yehuda Henkin, people like Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Hesder Yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. These are Talmidei
Giant of giants.
Yes,
Nachum Rabinovich
really,
was,
and he's not known enough in the American world.
Well, he's known in Ner Yisrael because I think he was a student. He is a product of Yeshiva's Ner Yisrael.
I did not know
I believe so, a student of Rav Ruderman. He is not well known enough in America.
Yeah.
America could use a Rav Nachum Rabinovich right now.
Yeah.
I think the world could.
Yes, and these Talmidei Chachamim, who were part of and leaders of that Leumi world, and who are very rooted in classic texts of our Masorah, of Gemara and Halacha and Shutim, they also weren't afraid to share their read of the text, even if they were different than other people's reads. Okay, so there's three areas where I have seen that really affect the Dati Leumi world.
I want to get down to the brass
Yeah,
tacks.
that's
I hope
the
these
area
three
of
areas
sleeves, of sleeve lengths.
Oh, there we go. Now we're getting into it. This is what I've been waiting for.
Okay, so sleeve lengths, pants, and hair covering. I think those are the three.
Let's hear. And I noticed it right away.
Right away.
You're missing one, which is a footnote. I would say it's 3.5. half.
What's that?
And the one you're missing is...
Oh, the nose. Yeah, because I don't think of that as a sneud issue.
That's stylistic. It's not halachic. It's stylistic.
The nose stud or multiple piercings in the ears.
I could do a whole series on how I, as an American, process and react when I meet primarily Israeli women who are super frum.
They could be your Tanakh teacher and they have a stud.
My child's teacher right now has a stud in her nose, and she's Israeli and she's living in America. I'll always notice it. I don't think I will ever be at a point in my life where I meet somebody with a stud in their nose and I don't even notice it. My first thing that I say in my head is like, oh, they have a stud in their nose. Like, I notice it. Like, I don't notice when somebody's wearing glasses or not.
You notice it in Israel also because it's noticeable. And, some people think it's beautiful and some people don't and some people, whatever. But it's funny. I don't think of that as like a tzniut issue. It obviously is a dress issue.
It's a dress issue. It's not a tzniut issue. Correct.
But it's not a tzniut issue in my mind. So that's why I guess it's the half. Okay, so this is how I think of it. Like, my impression is that these days in America, and you could corroborate if this is true, and this is, I think, even different from when I was in my 20s in America, which is 20-something years ago. If you want to be thought of as a serious from woman, you cover your elbow. And very committed and very religious women who daven 3 times a day and who are 100% halachic and who are very, very, very devoted to Torah learning and who are the most passionate and idealistic, a serious young man, let's say from the YU based medrash, will not be open to dating them if they don't cover their elbow.
Correct.
Right? Okay, so still from far, I think I have that down.
And that changed, meaning my sister, back to the Woodmere sister, 2 years in Michala, I don't know that she came back with that language, knowing that, and I'm using her because my other 2 sisters became Haredi, but she became modern Orthodox, but when she came back at that time in the 90s, they didn't even make shirts like that, like the thin...
And I'm the oldest of 4 girls and daughter of rabbi, and my parents, who are very halachic and were very makpid on our dress, even growing up in Great Neck, they never said that we had to cover our elbow. We couldn't wear very short sleeves. My mother covered her elbow, but that was not something that they insisted on for us. And many of us took that on, over the years on our own, but that was not part of my upbringing. And the 3 poskim that I mentioned, none of them think that halachically a woman has to cover her elbow. They all think of it as a chumrah. And they base, we're not going to do a whole podcast on tzniut now, but the Gemara in Ketubot that says that the zroa of a woman should not be seen talks about that the issue is mar'ez ro'atel livnei adam. The issue is showing your zroa to people. And these poskim talk about, well, what is the zroa? They bring proofs that the zroa is the upper arm, but it doesn't include the elbow. Like, there's a Mishnah that lists the different parts, and it lists the zroa separately than the marpik, than the elbow. So they say, you see, the zroa is not, and therefore these poskim, they discuss, okay, so the zroa is the upper arm has to be covered, how much of the upper arm has to be covered, and some of them, like Rav Nachum Rabinovich, even just says the majority, rove of the upper arm has to be covered, but he doesn't even have to say that it has to approach the elbow or touch the elbow, and they don't think of themselves as like, oh, well, serious people or the Chatchila Jews cover the elbow, and what I'm saying is for the people that aren't as serious. They say this is 100% Lechatchila, the psak, and if you do more than that, then that's very nice. And, kol ha'machmir tavo la bracha. But they think of it as a chumrah. The same way that there are people, by the way, poskim who think you have to cover your whole arm. Yeah. And therefore, it's so important for, I think, everybody out there. When I teach these halachot, I don't only bring those 3 rabbanim. I also bring Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says you have to cover your elbow. But specifically, I want my students to see the whole range so that they could respect and not write off people who do less than them as not being halachic, or people who do more than them as being crazy extremists. And I think if the American community wants to follow the psak that you could cover your elbow and gezintehe, and there's many, many poskim, probably the majority of poskim, who advocate for that, at least to know that the young women or the older women that they see in Israel who are not wearing very short sleeves, nobody will say that there's halachic basis for that, but who are wearing a sleeve that is midway, covering their upper arm or longer than that, it's because of really, important poskim who hold that way. And the same is true for pants. I do not know of poskim out there who think that tight pants are okay, even though there are some, like Rav Ovadia Yosef, who writes that I would prefer that over a miniskirt. But there are a good number of poskim who say that loose pants, especially with a longer shirt, are totally halachic. Now, we could talk about, and I do talk about, why these have not been culturally accepted in many communities, and there's what to say, but we should not write off those who wear halachically acceptable pants as not being firm Judaism or not being committed or not being serious about their Jewish identity or about what they do. I do not wear pants, and my daughter at this point, she's only 11 and a half, but I have not raised her to wear pants. But sometimes I look around and I see the very tight skirts that from women are wearing, whether in America or in Israel. And then I see these looser, more flowy pants that you see today in Israel and the Dati Leumi community. And I wonder if as a community, we wouldn't maybe benefit from shifting our focus away from just the skirt. Doesn't matter what skirt, doesn't matter how tight. And I see that as true with pants. And the last category, which is the hair covering, I think some of the differences that you see are cultural. Like sheitos are much more common in America, maybe because people work in secular society and they don't want to stand out and they just want to look, normal like everyone else.
Also financially.
Also, I was going to say they're much more expensive. Exactly. And here, in Israel, it's just, again, whether it's because it's just simpler or because the whole mipacha culture, I think, is influenced both by Middle Eastern culture and African turban styles. But some differences that you will see are also based on different reads of the sources and of how much hair you have to cover. So I would encourage listeners, there's a website called Zeracheha that I'm involved in that's run by my friend Lori Novik. It's a whole website on women and mitzvot. And there we really try to bring the whole range, the whole gamut of sources. And I also once did a podcast specifically on hair covering. And there are so many respected poskim who think that you could leave out hair. And more than just a tafach, which is the well-known opinion of, more than just a little bit, which is the well-known opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. They think you could leave out, a bun or leave out some hanging or even like cover a rova of your hair, but leave out a good amount. And I think, again, just to be melamed zchut, that the people that you're seeing that are doing they're wearing a mipacha, but the whole middle is open, or even the headband, I just want to be melamed zchut that the headbands, there could be that there are poskim who, give a nod towards that. But even the headband, I try to look at it as that kisoy rosh, head covering in Israel, in the Dati Leumi community, is almost universal. Yeah, even the woman in tight jeans, who in America would never be covering her hair, in Israel is usually wearing at least a headband. As opposed to looking at it.
That is it. Meaning, in America, we have a smaller group who are doing like elite halachic observance. Like elite.
Exactly.
They're like the commandos and they take on all the stringencies, but it makes this topic seem out of reach if you're just like kind of regular, just like a I don't know, I'm thinking my wife, like doesn't want to be a commando in the Tznius army. She wants to be a regular, the Sheirut Leumi in Tznius. She would probably do that. And in Israel, I think we lose so many, and you see in Israel, you're able to reach so much more with the halachic category, even though it's not the, let's call it like that elite halachic maximalist. Like, you're not looking for the most stringent opinion. You're looking for the opinion that could almost like encompass and create a culture among the broadest amount of the community. And America never really learned how to do that well.
Yeah, and I think it may go back to the categorization that we spoke about.
Yeah.
Either you're on the derech or you're off. Either you're super firm and legitimate or you're not. And I think there's definitely things, as someone who made Aliyah, that like I miss about that more rigid, like, come on, this is just how it's supposed to be, where we grew up at a time where like your parents, your teachers said, this is what you do. And like, okay, that's what we did. We were good from girls. But in educating my students and even my daughter, for me, I stay focused on my value is adherence to halacha. But within that, I am going to give room, even to my daughter. Like if my daughter would come to me and she'd say, Ima, I studied the Mekorot and I'm going to wear pants, but only halachically acceptable pants. It's not what I do, but I'd be very okay and happy and comfortable as long as I know that she is committed to halacha. She didn't just do whatever she wanted. She thought seriously about it. And it makes me so happy because I'm involved a lot in shidduchim here. And when I speak...
I was about to ask, the shidduch consequences in America for dress are drastic in both ways. A woman who would wear jeans is going to get set up, even if religiously they're the same in every other way, is going to be going to set up with a drastically different type of person.
I know women like that who feel like they can't find the right shidduch for themselves in America because they're very committed and very serious, and they're not looking for someone who's not serious about their Judaism. And, and that's why it makes me happy when I speak to a young man in Israel. First of all, I always say, let me ask you just about like what you're looking for in terms of dress, because these things are important important at the end of the day. I don't want you to like be set up with someone that'd be like, well, you didn't tell me that, or that's not relevant for me. So some will say to me, I really understand that there's halachic opinions to not cover your elbow, and I totally respect that. Or there's halachic opinions to wear loose pants. And again, this is how I talk to my daughter. But like for me, like my comfort zone is someone who does cover her elbow, or someone who's only going to wear skirts. And that's also my comfort zone. And I totally respect, and that's who I'll set him up with. But when a young man says to me, Shayna, what's most important to me is that she's very rooted and grounded in halacha, and that she doesn't make any decisions without thinking deliberately and intentionally about her commitments. But if she, decided that she learned this topic and she knows and she has people she turns to, and she's gonna not cover all her hair, or she's whatever, but like it's coming from that very authentic, genuine place, I'm okay with that. And I think there's a lot more openness to that in Israel. And in my own house and with my own kids, I try to infuse my kids with both, that there's sources and there's lines and there's commitments. And on the other hand, the ruach behind it, the spirit behind it is no less important. Like we don't want just the letter of the law without the spirit of the law. We don't want just the spirit of the law without the letter of the law. We want the structure and the content. We want the external and the internal. But when you move from one culture to another, I think it induces a lot of humility. It's like you think you had it right. You think you knew the way it should be done, or like your culture, like that's the right way. And then you're like, wow, like, okay, maybe this isn't my comfort zone, but there's also something very deeply meaningful and important about this way of doing things. So I have to find that right balance.
I love that. The humility. Right when you said that, I was thinking, I grew up in the Five Towns and I moved to Teaneck, and there are very different cultural differences. And I feel like my issue was my lack of humility when I first moved here. I felt like I know, it's the right thing where I grew up. And you really need a humility in order to be successful. We've been talking for a very long time. I want to jump straight to the final question, which is really about Aliyah and how you guide or talk to Americans who are thinking about Aliyah right now. Meaning, you're talking about an Aliyah pipeline, which is different, I think, than a Michlala, MMY, and I'm going to move to Ramat Eshkol, which is very American. I know that's very inside, but that American pipeline where it's a little bit more yeshivish and it's quite a bit more American.
Yes.
What are you talking about? You're single. You feel boxed in America. It's just not it. You don't feel like you're able to maintain your Yiddishkeit. I know many people who the dating world in America is not working and they now want to make Aliyah. How do you walk people through that decision? And we should mention that you literally wrote an entire book on decision making, what you really want, published by Koren. But tell me how you walk people through that choice.
So when I chose the title of the book, it was very deliberate, because that is the question that I would often hear myself asking people. What do you really want? And people say, I don't know. That's why I came to talk to you. But I've learned that if you sit and you listen, and you listen closely, you could often help people realize that they know what they really want, that it is deep in there. A lot of times they have a lot of fears that are getting in the way of them being able to realize what they really want, but it's there. So when someone comes to sit down with me at the age of 19 and she's in her year in Israel, and she says to me, I'm sure I'm making Aliyah at the end of this year, but I just want to talk to you about it anyway, but I'm sure I'm making it. So already I'm like, well, the people that are just sure they're making it, they usually just make it. And they're not like, can I just, so already my antenna go up. And then when I sit down with someone and I say, so what's on your minds? I hear you want to make Aliyah, how come you want to make it? So when the first thing that she says to me is, well, when I was on Mechlalet, or when I was on Give, or when I was on Machach, I told all my friends that I'm for sure making Aliyah after my year in Israel.
American camps.
Yeah.
American camps.
But they told their friends in camp after 10th grade when they came to Israel for the summer that they're for sure staying in Israel after their year. So I'm hearing okay, but do you actually want to stay here now that you're here? And sometimes her eyes will well up with tears. And it's well, you can't stay in Israel because that's what you told people back in 10th grade. It's but now everyone's gonna, be I can't believe she didn't do what she said. And you hear there's a fear there of what are people going to think of me? Or if someone says, well, I have to come now because otherwise I'm going to get stuck in America. America. I'm like, but do you really want to come now? Or, because it's like, now, why is that so important to me? It also goes in the opposite direction where someone will say to me, Shayna, is it crazy that I want to make Aliyah, even though I know I'm going to miss my family? And I know that it's going to be hard to date here away from, everyone. And I know that like just living with friends. And I know that like the way that the university college system works here is so different. She's like, but I just want to be here. And I think when I talk to people about any decision, and definitely about such a huge one like Aliyah, that question of like, do you really want this is so huge, because someone who really wants it and they know that they want it, when they wake up on a hard day because it's Sukkot and they don't have family to go to and they have to build their own sukkah, or they're living with apartment mates and they don't have a home to go to for Shabbos and they're getting on their nerves, or because they just ran into something bureaucratic in Israel, or because someone was rude to them and they're like, why am I here? They need to know deep inside, because I want to be here, because I chose to be here, not because this is the place we're all supposed to be, not because I told my 10th grade friends. And I think that when I guide people towards good decision making, it's a lot about learning to trust yourself and to trust your instincts and to not let those fears get in the way. You have to pay attention to the fears and say, wait, why do I have that fear? Obviously, fear is very important. It's important for us to realize when we're afraid of something, and it's important that we're afraid of it. But when it's a fear that you're like, no, I have that fear, but I want this anyway. And I think with Aliyah, it comes down to that. There's a lot of young people, especially today, that want to make Aliyah, but they're afraid of being far from their family. They're afraid of, finances in Israel. They're afraid of navigating the system. But then you say to them, those are all really good reasons not to make Aliyah. And they're like, I know, but I just want to come. I just want to be here. I wake up every morning in Israel and I feel like this is who I am and this is where I belong. And then I know that it's right for them. And if it's not right for them at 19 and it's very clear to me, then I'll say to them, it doesn't sound to me like you want to be here right now. And that's okay. I made Aliyah when I was 31 with 4 kids. And I have many students who went back for college in America and they came after college single, or others who came when they first got married. There's no right time. The right time is when you're going to be able to come here and feel like you could own your decision and stand behind it and believe in it. So that's in terms of general decision making. Now, if you're talking about a single who's struggling in America, I'll just say that being a single in Israel is often very different than being in America. And that's like a whole other topic in of itself. But sometimes someone who has been a single for years in America and just needs to like break out of that, it's not even so much about coming to Israel as much as like they kind of just need a restart. Yeah. They need a restart. They need a different vibe. They need a different community. And the single community and dating in Israel, similar to so many other things we said, I guess that's the theme, just much less formal, much more relaxed, more, like Zoreim, people more flow with it. And I think sometimes when you've been in a world that's like more formal and there's more rules and there's more protocol. And
are there resumes in Israel? Shidduch resumes in Israel?
Not in the communities that I'm in.
Not in the Dati.
If anything, they have like these little blurbs that they write about themselves on WhatsApp, like, hi, I'm so-and-so. I grew up here. I went to here. I did Shavut here. I did the army here. I went to Midrashah here, and like, this is what important to me. This is what I'm looking for. Like, mamash, like a couple of paragraphs. And if I want to set someone up, like I'll turn to a guy. I'll send him that. I'll send him a picture since I know anyone's going to go to the internet. And then I'll leave a voice note and say, this is why I think it's a good idea. And Zehu, sometimes I'll ask around or whatever, but like parents in our community aren't really involved. There's a lot of great shidduch apps that people use here. Just more chill. And also the single communities, even the really frum kids, not the kid that's going to move to Ramat Eshkol, but still like the really frum seminary girls who stay in Israel and they go to Bar Ilan and they live in Givat Shmuel, or they live in Yerushalayim and they go to, Machon Tal, or they go to Hebrew U. The single communities here, definitely of Olim, are often pretty mixed in terms of the men and the women, even the really from young men and women. And that's not considered not from, which is also just different than I think sometimes how it works in America. And also singles here, especially Olim, but even like my single Israeli students who move to Yerushalayim, they invest in their single lives. It's like they buy furniture, they get dishes, they put down a carpet, they put pictures on the wall. The Olim, like that is their home. They don't go home for Shabbos. That is their home. But I think the attitude here in general of singles is like, we're going to live our best life. Maybe
this
because,
is a part of my life.
Yeah,
this
maybe because
like
people know in Israel, like, you never know what life's going to bring. Maybe it's coming from there. But there is a feeling of like, I'm going to live my best life. I would love to get married, but I'm not waiting to get married. Like, these are amazing years. I'm going to travel and I'm going to have experiences and I'm going to, grab hold of these opportunities. And also because people, like women, do 2 years of Shivut Leumi or 2 years of the army or 3 years of the army and a year of Midrashah or 2 years of Midrashah. And men, certainly, if they go to Hesder, it's at least 5 years yeshiva and army. So it's like you only start university when you're 22 or 23. And it's not that feeling in America of like, I'm 22, I just finished college and I'm not married. Oh my gosh, I'm so old. It's like life is just getting started at 22 years old. So that also affects the mentality a lot. And in general, it's a little bit more laid back.
On a very personal level, before I give you my rapid fire questions, I really want to say a thank you to you because you were one of the early supporters who understood, because I think you have this sophistication and depth when it comes to religious decision making, of seeing a spectrum of the community in such a holistic and generous and positive way. The chizuk you have given me over the years of seeing what we are trying to do, I've always felt like we have been rowing in the same direction. And I am just so grateful on the most personal level. People have reached out, not to be a guest, but just to talk about what we're talking about the authenticity of religious experience, which is something that you talk about constantly. And anytime you speak, it is worth listening to. I'm so grateful for joining today. I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid fire questions. My first question is really a book recommendation. I always look for book recommendations. I would love a book recommendation that almost gives a window. Are there, like, it could be even in Hebrew, a window to the world? What are the books that women in seminary right now, in the Midrashah, are like attracted to, that are addressing that, what the term used, safa ruchanit, like that religious language that is connecting to women that maybe in America they're not really familiar with, like these go in waves. And there's a lot of stuff happening in the creativity of Torah in Israel that Americans are simply unaware of. Is there anything that comes to mind specifically in that area, book recommendations?
I would get your hands on Rav Dov's book on tefillah. I think that gives a window into some of this language.
Hikon Tefilasi, I think it's called.
And I think, is it in English? Or are they thinking about
Yes,
English?
Rav Dov Zinger, but the Hebrew is marvelous.
Yeah, in Migdalus, the works of Rav Shagar are very popular. Some of those have been translated into English also. Just, they give you a little bit of a sense of the world, that I'm talking about in terms of a little bit more of that spiritual or like beneath the surface, more internal kinds of language that's very popular here and very meaningful here.
My next question, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical for as long as you needed to go back to school to get a PhD, write a book of your choice, what do you think the subject and title of your PhD would be?
I'd probably pursue things in the area of therapeutic work and social work or things like that. I'm a big proponent of therapy. I've gone for myself. I send all my kids. I think it's people who are strong go for therapy to understand themselves, to be able to be more self-aware. And I've done a lot of, counseling of students and people and whatever over the years, but be able to go back and maybe get that actually formal education, because I know what my boundaries are and what my limits are, and I'm very careful not to cross them, would be something that would be meaningful for me.
My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
I do not get enough sleep. I usually go to sleep somewhere between, 12 and 1, 12 and 2, that area, 12 and 1.
Okay.
I try for sure by 1, and sometimes I'm lucky by 12, and I wake up around 6:30, 6:45. Which is not terrible, but not enough sleep.
But it's not great. Not great. You're not always hitting that, even the 6-hour mark. Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg, my cousin, my mashgicha, I cannot thank you enough. You are so generous with your time, with your thought. Thank you so much. We hope to have you on again. Please stay in touch, and thank you so much. much for today.
Thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing for our community.
I have a dear friend who I studied Bechavrusa with one-on-one when we were in the Beis Medrash. His name is Jake Sasson or Yaakov Sasson. He's really incredible for those who know him. He works as an actuary full-time, but he publishes articles on the Svarim blog. He published in Chakira on stuff that weave together history as well as halacha. He's really one of the brilliant, totally off the radar scholars of our generation. He doesn't really, teach publicly. He just actually published a book that I would be excited. He didn't ask me. I'd be excited to plug. It is a rabbinic work called Sus Anochi. It's in a deep rabbinic Hebrew. It is absolutely brilliant. You can buy it from Machon Ale Zayas. I'm incredibly grateful for Jake. I'm not here to plug his work, but one thing that he pointed out to me is that in Rav Charlap's published letters, Rav Charlap, who served as the dean of Yeshiva University's rabbinical school, they published, I believe, a lot of his letters. I think this appears in a volume called Zeved Tov that was edited by somebody named Rabbi Zatz. But anyways, he sent me a letter when Rabbi Charlap passed away, which was just earlier, I believe, in the last year or so. Rav Zvulun Charlap, who was really an incredible figure, a titan of American Jewish history, American Jewish life. I mean, he's the keeper of all secrets. He was really an incredible person. But when he passed away, he reminded me of a really beautiful letter that I wanted to share with you that highlights the differences, at least at that time, between the United States and Israel. It was a letter that his grandfather, Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, who was really the prized student of Rav Kook. It was Rav Kook's number one student, really an incredible person, wrote several volumes called Mei Marom, and he was the grandfather of Rav Charlap, who served in Yeshiva University. And there is a letter, it's an incredible letter that he sent to his grandson, the Rabbi Charlap of Yeshiva University, right when he was beginning his studies. He was a bar mitzvah boy. And this is what he writes, Ma ma'od simchasenu besurasecha hayikaros. I'm so happy with all the good news. Kotosef tamid lahodieni, meshlomcha b'chol pratecha. Keep me informed, keep me up to date. Ki hineni mitkagea ladas mikol asher etcha. I am lovesick. I am so excited to hear everything that's going on in your life. And then he sends him the following bracha. And it's really beautiful to imagine a time when grandparents were writing this ways to their grandchildren. It's really, really remarkable. And then he writes as follows. His grandchild is in America, is about to start Yeshiva University. Evarechecha l'regel hikanesecha b'yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. I want to bless you for now that you are entering the Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan. Shakod al haTorah va'ale mala mala. You should plug away with diligence in your Torah study and keep ascending to greater and greater heights. Kechol ma shetir beyoser es She'ifosecha legadlus. The more that your holy ambitions, that your ambitions for greatness grow, Tigdal Yoser, you will grow more. Ein lekametz b'she'ifos. Don't be stingy with your religious ambitions. Hashe'ifa hi hamora derech l'shoif. Your ambition, what you are yearning for, is the way forward for those yearning, is the road ahead of you. Tishaf lihios gadol b'Yisrael. You should desire, you should have the ambition to be a great leader of the Jewish people. He's telling this to a 13-year-old. And then he writes as follows. Hamusag Yehudi Ne'eman. The notion of being a trustworthy Jew, a good Jew, Eino Kolel Hakol. That's not everything. Zehurak bitoy Americani. That is an American expression. Aval ata tzarech lihios eretz Yisraeli. You need to be like an Eretz Yisrael Jew. Einecha v'libcha yihiyu sham kol hayamim. Your eyes and your heart should always be placed there at all times. Yehei Hashem imach v'kulanu nechzebach kol ma she'anu rotzim u'mekavin liros b'cha. God should be with you, and we should all see the vision that we want from you and that we anticipate seeing from you. And then he signs it. It's beautiful. Ziknecha, your grandfather, Hamanashik Oscha Meirachok B'Neshikos Kodesh Me'eretz Yisrael, who is giving you kisses from a distance, kisses with the holiness of the land of Israel. It is an absolutely remarkable letter. And what fascinates me about this is in some ways I have seen I don't know that I would call it a reversal, but almost a change. I find in many ways that it is in Israel where there is a ambitious practicality. Actually, those who I know in Israel, their religious lives, their religious yearnings are actually not for transcendence. The people I know, and I mean this in the most laudatory, awe-inspired way, they are confronting God and greatness in the actual day-to-day of their lives. The way that he talks about she'ifos in this letter, I see it still in Israel, but it's expressed so practically, so like, I want this to be fully integrated into my life, as opposed to where in America, we almost want to transcend America. We want to escape. We want our religious ambitions to take us elsewhere. And again, the way that people yearn religiously in Israel versus America is very different. I think there is a practicality, and I see this both in the Dati Leumi community and in the Haredi community, that there is a practicality that it's like, I want my religiosity to be effortlessly expressed within my very individuality, within my very life. I want it integrated into my community and into the very society with which I live, as opposed to America, where that is obviously impossible for a host of reasons. The Jewish people are not sovereign in America. Religiosity, spirituality is almost an escape. It is transcendent. I'm not diminishing it by sharing those differences, and these differences are just something that I have noticed. They may not be true for you, but I think something that is really interesting and fascinating to think about are the ambitions of religious Jewry in Israel versus America different? And you see that yearning of religious teenagers, of people in their 20s. What are they yearning for, and how is that yearning expressed in their lives? I think is something that is distinct between Israel and America. And whether or not it's still a bitoy Americai, this idea of just being, a trustworthy Jew, that's not everything. There's something ambitious to rise beyond your communal expectations, to chart a new path, is something that I think we see right now unfolding this moment, and the headquarters of it are undoubtedly in the land of Israel with the people of Israel. And in an episode where we're thinking about both, there is a deep comfort in knowing that Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, even to his grandson who was 13 years old in America and built his life in America, still knew that it was possible that even in America, even the dean of Yeshiva University's rabbinical school, to still tzarech lihios eretz Yisraeli, to have that holiness that characterizes life in the land of Israel. Einecha v'libcha yihu sham kol hayamim. That your eyes and your heart should always be placed there all the days of your life. And it is not just his eyes and his heart, referring to Rabbi Charlap, but I think it is equally true, einenu v'libenu, our heart and our eyes, being reminded to be some kol hayamim, to be placed, some part of ourselves, some part of our ambition, some part of who we are and our very identity, to be connected to the land of Israel. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our incredible friend, Dina Emerson. Thank you, Dina. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. It doesn't cost you a penny, and it really, really helps us. You can also donate if you want to cost yourself a penny. You can also donate, of course, at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. We continue from the generosity and support of our listening community. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number, of course, is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org. 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Shomer Yisrael, Shemor She'eretz Yisrael, V'yal Yovad Yisrael, Omrim Shema Yisrael, Shomer Yisrael, Shemor She'eretz Yisrael,